Greetings. Once again, we're back with another video. On this part, we'll talk about Karl Marx and conflict theory. I'm going to keep this one really brief. I only have like 2 slides to get us through this. So let's go ahead and dive into it. All right. So Marx's conflict theory is essentially an understanding of how society is organized. Essentially, what he says is that social life is a competition. And it's the fight over the distribution of resources, power, and idea and understanding of inequality in society. And once again, this inequality in society is driven by this idea of class conflict, that there are essentially 2 classes in every society. There are those who own the means of production, which are the bourgeoisie, and then there are those who work for the owners, which is the proletariat. And this relationship, particularly this fight over production and power and resources, creates this unequal social class. So much so that the worker actually loses an aspect of their humanity through continued work. Because oftentimes what happens is you are doing work you don't have to really think about. So imagine once again, you have this person working at a BMW assembly line. All right. They have to catch the bus to work and home. Yet every day they're making and looking at these fine automobiles. And their job is to put the tires onto the car as the car comes down the assembly line. Now, it doesn't take a lot of thought to actually put the tires onto the car. So you're engaged in work all day long that requires very little thought or creativity. Certainly, this was not what you planned for in your life when you were in the 3rd grade talking about what you want to be in the future. So you begin to slowly lose a bit of your humanity. As this work is just something you have to go to do, and you begin to start clocking your life by the hours that you work. All right. And you become a repetitive machine because you do this 5 days a week, you rest on 2 days, and then you're back at it again. And that becomes the rest of your life. And you're so fatigued by it that you don't have the energy to do anything else in your spare time. So this idea of inequality is the result of class domination and land ownership, particularly because a lot of these theories, particularly in sociology, come as we transition from agricultural society into an industrial society. So land ownership was chief among those who actually had wealth. So once again, if you had land ownership and you owned the means of production, you were the dominating class, and that means you controlled the lives of others, and they became cogs in your machine. As far as schooling goes, what you get from conflict theory is what we call the reproduction theory of education. The education is only in existence to reproduce what we already have. So you're pretty much your fate based on your social class is all but determined before you even enter school. And what school does is train you to reproduce what we already have. So let's think of it this way. In economic, cultural, and hegemonic states of reproduction, your entire job is to satisfy society. So it's a class-based access to schools. So those who are of the wealthy class, they go to boarding schools. Those who are of middle class may go to wealthy public or even private schools. And those who are of the working class go to the school available to them. And because of that, and because of what we call a hidden curriculum, where people decide what you are to learn and decide if you are worthy of learning anything, you have what we call hegemonic reproduction. And hegemonic reproduction, or hegemony, is simply the rules of the dominant class. So the dominant class decides who gets to learn what and how. And even teachers, who are largely comprised of what we now today call the middle class, they're making decisions about how to deliver education and how much learning you should know based upon their thoughts about your children and their social class. So if they are convinced that they have children of wealth, they go all out. They plan, They deliver high quality instruction. They really care. They really work on behalf of the students, and they speak to the student as if they're going to be a future leader. But if they're convinced that your child is of the working or poor class, you get a reduced level of education experience. You're probably getting lessons that are about 3 or 4 grade levels behind, and very little is thought about you as a future other than relating school to work. So we're preparing you to become a cog in a machine later on in life. So what we also see here is that schools are organized in a structure of society. So schools actually replicate the existing social structure. And also, this is also a gender situation as well, because once again, we also track classes based on roles. So you may have a school with a magnet school with an allied health program. And it's amazing that we will begin to push boys into the medical sciences and talk to them like they're future doctors. And we push the young ladies into the nursing side of allied health and speak to them as if they are EMDs and paramedics and all of these kinds of things, more service related in the health sciences. We also do it with Project Lead the Way, or pre-engineering programs, where we push boys into Project Lead the Way, and we kind of make a barrier for young ladies to get into it. And I've had a situation like that. But we also then teach you civic education or social studies, not because you need to know history or how power and exchange works, but because we want you to understand and conform to the political society. We want you to know the rules so that you can obey the rules. We want you to participate or feel like you have say-so in society. So we push you to vote, not to know why you're voting, not to demand more of your political constituents, but we want you to be able to just vote. And that vote helps another class of people. So what we mean by reproduction, economic reproduction, means we're reproducing the social order. And you'll notice that in schools, that lower and working class children are generally told and taught how to accept authority, how to be punctual, how to wait, and how to be compliant. And if you think about it, when we punish kids for being tardy, what we're trying to tell them is to be punctual. When we tell kids to sit down and shut up and sit in columns in row, and if they go against authority, they are punished. Middle class children, however, they're taught to practice authoritative modes of self-presentation, so how to look important. And they're also taught to work independently. So if you go to more wealthier public schools, what you'll see is children being given leadership roles, children being allowed to actually have a voice in school, and also allowed to work more independently. So you may see a teacher take their class outside, and they'll work outside independently, and they can find their own way and things like that. And they use all of the resources available in the school. So when you go to the science lab, the teachers have actually unpacked the boxes, and they got triple beam scales, and they got ecosystems and things like that. So they're working very hard on behalf of those children, because they believe that they're going to be the management class of society. They're going to go and work higher up jobs to make sure that the wealthy are taken care of. And upper class children are taught to think freely. They're taught to be authoritative, even over their teachers, and to demand assistance. They're being trained to go to your MITs, your Harvards, your Princetons, your Yales, and things like that. And what they're taught to be is not just equal to their superiors, but oftentimes to actually assume the role of superior to their authoritative teachers and things like that. So you get that level of education under this reproductionist system. But teachers decide what kind of education and what kind of student will get based on their assumptions of class. So if I assume you are of a particular class, that tells me how to teach you. Sounds kind of depressing, but it's a little true. In a cultural reproduction, we're reproducing people based on a set of values. Now, while that sounds good, you have to question whose values, who made these values, who thought that these values were worthwhile? That's important to consider and think about as you think about how we reproduce culture in society. So for low and working class children, we socialize these children to value everything that the upper class, by giving you an upper class curriculum to make you read the classics and understand Shakespeare and Beowulf and Plato and Homer and all of these things that the so-called upper class values. We make you take tennis as part of your gym requirements. We make you do all of the activities that we believe are part of being part of this upper class, although we know you'll never take part in it. So you have to imagine the perspective of lower and working class children. You're trying to make me worship these people. And if you reduce that to the urban education setting with black and brown children, what we're saying is we're trying to make you white, or at least to respect white values, because you can never actually be that. Middle class children are taught to rely on their personality and relationships. And what they ultimately do is middle class children are adept at learning a code. And that code is a key to differentiating themselves from lower and working class children. So they learn the code of behavior and conduct. They learn how to schmooze with adults. They learn how to dress a particular way to portray themselves as part of the middle class. They also learn not to talk about it. So they don't, it's a hidden rule that you just don't talk about these things. But you learn the code on how to be successful. You actually learn the language to speak to be successful. Because it's really, education is about vocabulary. Not necessarily thinking, but mastering the vocabulary of a particular trade. So middle class children are taught that. And once again, teachers decide what kind of education a student will get based upon their respect for students' cultural capital. Every student brings cultural capital to a school setting. The problem is, do you respect the cultural capital that a student brings? If you respect it, then you incorporate it in the class. You actually make class and home mirror each other, what we call cultural responsiveness. But if you don't respect the cultural capital that a student brings to class, then what you try to do is educate them out of that and push them to value the things that you want them to value, rather than the things that they value having relevance to the course and the curriculum. An example of that would include deciding that that certain children do not speak well. So rather than get the message, and oftentimes when students say things, it may have a little bit of shorthand language. You understand what they're trying to say, but rather than move on with the conversation, you're busy trying to correct them and trying to make sure that they speak the King's English. That is a cultural reproducing aspect of education, where we're trying to train you to speak as if you are the middle and upper class. And what that does is that insults children who have determined a shorthand version of language to get the communication across. And remember, the purpose of talking or communicating is to get the message across, not necessarily to amaze you with oratory skills, but things like speech and debate, spelling bees. All of these are ways to begin to start imparting culture a person. Argument about children and vocabulary and the amount of words they know really is irrelevant to education. You cannot tell me at what point knowing 10,000 words is important. Because majority of the language you use is extremely simple. All right. And once again, the point of communication is to get the idea across. The last part of reproductive theory is this idea of the hegemonic state reproduction. And it's simply reproduction based on the social consensus of the dominant group. So the dominant group decides what happens in the school. And they do it in two distinct ways. One, they regulate knowledge production. They decide what is important to know and what is important not to know. So, perfect example of this is when The Soviets launched Sputnik back in 1957. It sent an alarm throughout America. And the first thing we did was decide to change the education system. And it was a back to the basics movement. We decided we're going to invest in math and science. And that's what students are going to learn above everything else, because we're going to get out into outer space as well. We can't let the Soviets beat us. And that launched a trip to the moon. That launched NASA, science programs, all of that stuff, National Science Foundation. All of that stuff was part of an event that happened that changed the paradigm in American education. Essentially, the dominant class decided that what was important to know was now that's regulating knowledge production. The next way of regulating schools is to regulate certification requirements and assessments. What counts as proof of knowledge? So what we've decided is for you to be a teacher in a classroom, you have to earn a certain degree and you have to pass a national test. At that point, it was the NTE. And then they broke that apart and it became different states had their own assessments. And then it came back very recently to having a national test. I believe Pearson, sponsors that test, things like that. So once again, we're back to this national, federal type of certification requirement. And also the assessment process. So we want to test what you know and be able to know that within a year, as if that is the purpose of education. And we all know that many of us plant seeds in education, and you're not responsible for exactly when they bloom. But if you do it by the annual test, what you plant in September needs to manifest itself in April. So that's to say that what you learn one day may not manifest itself 10 years from now. Oftentimes, one thing I learned in high school, in college rather, is that I had a pretty good high school experience because I could use the skills I had in high school in college. Well, that's not testable because it does not happen within the calendar year. So because of that, I've had to now revamp how I think about assessments. But that's how we control assessments. We regulate what is known and then what counts as knowledge obtained. So how do we know and can prove this? And you hear people talk about this all the time in education. Just didn't think of it as a reproductive tool. So this wraps up our understanding of Karl Marx and conflict theory and its application to schools. The next one coming up is Weber. So I'll have that one to you in a few minutes.